Yeah. So it is my pleasure to introduce Suzi Eszterhas. She is, her talk today is regarding wildlife photography as a woman. She is also going to share her journey as a wildlife photographer and why she started the foundation Girls Who Click, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to encourage young women to enter the male-dominated field of nature photography. And she is an award-winning wildlife photographer herself, best known for her work documenting newborn animals and family life in the wild. I will tell you that I came across her in Wildlife magazine, which is why I thought that was so interesting. And some beautiful pictures were in there as well, or photographs. She has photographed over 100 cover and feature stories for publications such as Time, Smithsonian, BBC Wildlife, the New York Times, Ranger Rick, and National Geographic Kids. And as an author, she has 23 books in print with another 4 in progress. So that's pretty ambitious. So recently named as an outstanding nature photographer of the year by the North American Nature Photography Association. So thank you for your patience, and it's my pleasure to welcome Suzi Eszterhas to the Science Ed Seminar. Thank you, Suzi. And just a quick question, we can have people put questions in the chat, or are you okay with people raising their hand and I can monitor the chat and go ahead and ask questions as you go?
That is absolutely fine to ask questions as I go. And then I always like I love questions. So, Q&A at the end also works really well, just in case I'm getting to the question that they're asking. But yeah, either one is fine with me. No need to have them write it in the chat. They can just raise their hand as long as you monitor it. I don't pay attention to it. Okay.
I can pay attention to it. So that you can share the screen and it's all yours. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay. Okay. So, all right. Thanks for your patience, everybody. So I just want to tell you a little bit about my job and my story of how I got started. First of all, I absolutely love my job. It is everything I've always wanted to do in my life. I basically am a freelance wildlife photographer. I travel the world taking pictures of animals, but more than that, I do in-depth stories on baby animals growing up. I do a lot of other topics and I weave in conservation and science, but most of what I do has a real strong focus on baby animals and that story of growing up, and then I weave things around it. The baby animal passion has always been mine ever since I was a kid. And I turn these stories into magazine stories and also various book projects as well. And it is something that I've been doing full time for about 15 years. And it's an incredibly difficult field to make a living in. There are specific challenges that I will talk about today in being a woman. But generally speaking, for anyone coming into this career, it's a very competitive and difficult place to make a living. Like I said, I was one of those really strange kids where it was like at age 6, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. And I told my parents I was going to go live in a tent in Africa. And I think they thought that I would grow out of that, and I never did. This is a picture of me, obviously looking very fashionable and fabulous at a zoo, actually. So I wasn't even in the wild anywhere. I didn't have any opportunities to go anywhere exotic as a kid. So I used to go to places like zoos or local nature preserves. I even would take pictures in my backyard of my house cats and pretend they were tigers in India. My whole life as a child was really centered around this idea of being with wildlife and taking pictures. And I used to go and hang out in the trees in the backyard. I hated school. School was a really hard place for me. I was a very shy kid and a very unique kid. So I got bullied a lot at school. As you could tell, like dressing like this, one probably would. And I would come home and I would find my sanctuary in the forest that we had. We had an acre of open space on our property, which really was my sanctuary growing up. And I would go into the trees there and observe squirrels and birds. I would take notes on their behavior. So I was very much kind of like working as a scientist too. I idolized Jane Goodall and Diane Fossey. And so I'd have my little notes of their behavior and sketches of them and that kind of thing. Again, just at zoos, pretending like I was in the wild. And then this is a cat that I had that I used to take wild pictures of in the backyard. So this passion like never subsided, it never went away. By the time I went to college at UC Santa Cruz, this was my absolute goal. But I knew getting a degree in photography wouldn't really help me in this field. So I got an environmental studies degree, and I had essentially what would be like a photography minor. Santa Cruz had a very creative create your own major program at the time, which is what I was a part of. But I was living in a place where I was really close to beauty. I was close to all these gorgeous coastal landscapes. But I really wanted to go to places like Africa. And so what I did was I took a semester abroad and went to Tanzania. And during that time, I met a BBC film crew who took me on as an informal apprentice on their Serval Cat film, which is really an incredible opportunity for me to learn how to live in the bush, how to be around wild animals, how to habituate shy animals, all these things that you really can't learn in California when working with harbor seals and sea otters. I learned there in the wilds of Africa when I was only around 19 years old. Also, this is a picture I took when I was 19. So this is my first lion hunt, and it was something that I'll remember to this day, just being so lucky to witness something like this, but also something very emotionally powerful. And that's one of the things that is very difficult about this job is witnessing things in nature, but more so, which I'll talk about later, is witnessing things that we are doing to nature. This is that film crew that took me on. They're my close friends to this day. They produced a lot of big cat films for the BBC. It's Owen Newman and Amanda Barrett. And I went and worked with them on 3 different films after that. And what I did was I had a job after college at the Santa Cruz SPCA as a PR director. And my boss really believed in what I wanted to do. So she would let me work overtime so that I could gain this time to go in the field in Africa. Meanwhile, I was working on a lot of local subjects like harbor seals still in my off time at home, and sea otters. And the harbor seals and the sea otters gave me my first opportunity to really work with certain species in depth, where I would go back season after season after season and really get to know these animals incredibly well, some of them even as individuals rather than just as a species, which started to give me an edge on what I was doing photographically and made my work a bit more saleable, because I had all these in-depth, I was the only photographer that really had harbor seals giving birth. And so I started to sort of make a name for myself. My first story was on harbor seals, and that was for Ranger Rick magazine. And the editor kind of knew me at the time as the harbor seal girl. So I sort of stood out because I was doing this in-depth work that nobody else was doing, which in hindsight gave me a real edge to get started and get published. And then I started working in blinds and started, having different opportunities to work with different species and different ways of shooting. And this is me sort of dressed up completely in camo, and I was trying to get sea otters giving birth in this area on the pickleweed. But I was just trying out all these different techniques of working with these local species. And then I really got my opportunity to start doing some exotic travel in the United States by leading bear tours every year up in Alaska. And that was a very interesting experience for me. I grew up in California, where things are pretty liberal. And I would say throughout my entire childhood, I was treated pretty much as an equal being a woman. And then I started to, in Alaska, I got my first very sort of minor experiences dealing with sexism, and it was dealing with some of the sort of bear guides and fishing guides that were kind of these older generation men that were quite sort of salt of the earth and very, very much not used to a woman being in charge of a group. And at the time I was bringing photographers with me. So that was like my first sort of little foray into having some experiences with some minor sexism. And then I started working up in the Arctic areas, in areas that were really, really cold, -40. And so we have, in this job, one of the great challenges is really pushing yourself physically and testing yourself in environments that are quite unforgiving, whether it's like the depths of a jungle with chimps or whether it's -40 with polar bears. These environments can be really, really harsh and difficult places to work in. And so there's a sort of level of like physical toughness that you need to have in this job that, not all of us are raised with. I certainly wasn't growing up in Marin County, California. I didn't really have any sort of harsh environments that I was operating in. So this is me in -40, really dressed for it. Generally speaking, 6 layers on every part of your body, including your head and your hands. So even really difficult to operate your hands, and that, use your hands to take pictures is really hard. And this photo here, it was a moment that I will cherish forever. And it is a moment where this little cub, I was working with a biology team who was darting moms and cubs as they were leaving their den in a very significant global warming study. And essentially what Ian Sterling had shown over these 20 years of his research was that the cubs were, number one, coming out skinnier out of the den every year. And mom was going in the den less nutritionally fit. So basically she hadn't had enough seals, and then coming out quite skinny. And every year they were tracking this progress. And then the cubs not really being part of triplets anymore. Triplets used to be very common, and then it became sort of twins and singles. This was my first story really doing conservation photography and science, and working with this guy was really quite a powerful experience. But this cub in particular had been tranquilized, and one of the things that can happen with mammals is they can start to lose body temperature regulation when they're tranquilized. And this cub was essentially just getting cold. And Nick said, can you hold this polar bear cub and try to warm her up? And I was like, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. So I got to snuggle a polar bear cub, which was really quite an amazing experience. And then started to work on ships. And again, this was hard work as well. And it was, I had one of my experiences was working on a ship in Antarctica. And essentially just my job was like unloading people on and off of Zodiacs. Some of my ship experiences throughout the world were really hard. I did have an experience where I was one of 12 on staff on a ship, and 11 were men, and me, I was the only woman. And I did go through some pretty heart-wrenching hazing and sexism and at times sexual harassment, being the only woman and being isolated kind of, in this environment where you felt like you couldn't really complain, couldn't really say anything. I was quite young as well, so I'd never experienced these things before. And they were really, really difficult for me to navigate. So I will get to later, but one of the things I really work with the girls that I mentor is just simple things like what to say if you were being harassed, what to say if you got sexism happening, what do you say to the perpetrator, what do you say to upper management, when do you say something, when do you keep quiet? These are all things that women who haven't experienced this before, it can be really, really, really tough to navigate these situations. It took me many years to be able to stand up for myself and to do it in a way that was professional and appropriate. I think a lot of the early years I spent, whenever I experienced something like this, I unfortunately didn't necessarily have a lot of strength, and I would, quietly cope with it and be emotional, like in my cabin at night by myself, and essentially just, cry about it because I didn't really know what else to do. So that's one of the things that I really believe in, is empowering young women so that they have, the ability to stand up and say very calmly and professionally that this is not something that I will tolerate. And it's much harder to do that in situations when you're very remote and very isolated. That is a really huge challenge. It's not like the same kind of environment as being in a corporate environment. They have their own challenges, but being remote adds an extra layer of feeling very alone. And then I had my sort of big break, so to speak. I'm going to cruise through some of these slides a little bit quickly. But basically, I had a moment at the time I was doing these gigs on ships. They were sort of a month at a time here and there, and I was still working my PR job. So one of the things about this job is you can't just graduate college and be like, I'm going to be a wildlife photographer. That's just a total pipe dream. You have to build your portfolio, get a name for yourself, start selling images. So it took me a long time, and I had this job for 6 years. And one of the things that I was able to do, because I had this boss that believed in my career aspirations, I was able to bring it to part-time, and I was doing some of it remotely, and that was great. And so I was able to go off on these gigs on ships or up in Alaska for a month or 2 months at a time, and then come back to my job. But I still hadn't made it full-time, and I was feeling quite demoralized about this. And I was in a really hard point in my life. The other thing that I was going through at the time that I also share with the young women that I work with is that I was in a violent relationship, and I was in that relationship for 7 years. And so I was living with this guy that was terrible. I wasn't making it full time. And one of the things that I'd done is when I was in Africa with that BBC film crew, I'd made friends with the lodge owner, and I'd said, my dream is to work with cheetah cubs. And they said, well, if we see any cubs that are really tiny, we'll let you know. So at this pivotal moment in my life, this email came binging into my inbox, and it said, there's cheetah cubs, you should come now. And this had been 2 years. I assumed that Paul and Lou forgot about me. And I decided to radically change my life. And it was a moment that is the most important in my trajectory as a human being and as a professional wildlife photographer to this day. I chose to break up with the boyfriend, move out, put all my stuff in storage, and spend all my savings and hop on a plane to Africa. I thought I would stay 2 months, and I wound up staying 3 years. And I set up shop and lived in a bush camp there. My first experience there was I was focusing on cheetahs. So I had 18 months with 4 or 5 different cheetah families. And basically followed these families from sunrise to sunset. I had a Land Cruiser that I was initially I rented a Land Cruiser, and then I actually bought a little Suzuki for myself. But these cubs grew up around me. They would jump on the hood and look inside. That was something that they did regularly. They weren't really trying to interact with me as much as they were actually just looking out over the plains and looking for prey coming towards them. But it was an incredible thing to watch some of these animals grow up. It was also a heartbreaking thing to watch some of them not make it. I had a litter of 5 cubs that all died over a 19-day period, which really tested me emotionally. I was very attached to these cubs because I had been, when you spend sunrise to sunset with wild animals, even though you're not interacting with them and it's not like being around domestic animals, you still get very attached. You root for them. They all have personalities that come up. And so it was a very, very difficult time for me to watch all of them die. And this is where I lived for 3 years. This was the tent that I had. It was an absolutely incredible experience for the first year and a half. There was no power, just kerosene lamps. And then I wound up getting solar after that, which made things easier. At first, I was having to charge things off the car battery. And then I had solar after that, which made things quite luxurious. This is my little car that I eventually bought and drove around in. It takes a lot of courage, although I didn't feel like it was brave at the time. I think I just was so laser focused. I was just like, let's do this. But it takes a lot of courage to just whiz around the Mara. And there's no roads or anything like that. If you get a flat tire, you've got to deal with it on your own. There's obviously no AAA to call out there. So there's a very, very different way of life. I wound up hanging out with lion prides and jackals. Again, I'm going to whiz through these pretty quickly. Elephants. So I stayed there for 3 solid years. I then started doing some work in India. I was one of, I think, 3 or 4 photographers that the government of India granted a permit for me to photograph at a wild tiger den. I think one of 3 or 4 photographers since 1982. I worked for 2 years to get permission. So that was just like paperwork, meetings, trying to get permission to do this. It was also the most difficult place to this day that I've worked as a woman. I actually had to hire a project manager there to attend meetings for me, because there were literally meetings that I was told you should not come in because you're a woman. And if you come in, we're not going to achieve what we want to achieve. So I would literally sit in the parking lot in the vehicle while my project manager would attend these meetings as my representative to get things done. So it's a very, very difficult place being a woman. Started working in jungles. And that was really an intense experience. These jungle projects were some of the most unforgiving environments that I'd been in. But I was set off on a grade 8 project, which took up a couple years of my life, photographing these different grade apes all over the world. I'm currently an ambassador for the Sumatran Orangutan Society. Their plight is something that is really close to my heart. It's, I won't get into detail just because of time, but they are really affected by palm oil, which is essentially in everything that we eat and put on our bodies throughout the world. These palm oil plantations have just basically decimated their habitat. And I've done a lot of work with the Sumatran Orangutan Society and their team, going out and rescuing some of these orangutans that are completely trying to live on these clear-cut patches and essentially starving to death. So again, this is a situation where I'm the only woman, and it was an amazing experience being the only woman here. Lots of times that can be a very hard experience, but this situation was really amazing. These guys were so lovely to work with, nothing but respectful, and an incredible display of generosity. We were staying at a homestay, a very, very modest, tiny home in a village. We're actually staying with an informant that works with SOS and lets SOS know when there's a baby on the black market, an orangutan baby. And there was a bedroom, and all these guys gave me the bedroom while they all basically slept in a heap on the floor in the living room, and were just so kind to me and so lovely. This is a very Islamic culture, and so one of the things that I do everywhere I go in the world is I always dress appropriate to the culture, and I try to act appropriate to the culture as well. So, you know, if it's a culture where you're not going to hang out with a guy when it's dark, you know, after dinner or whatever, just a colleague or whatever, I don't do that. And so I really try to, as much as I can, act like a woman in that culture. If it's a culture where you dress really modestly and completely cover up and never show your arms or your legs, I dress that way as well, because I think that's incredibly important in terms of number one, personal safety, and number two, respecting the culture you're in. That can also be very challenging because it can, you know, I grew up in a place where I could wear whatever I want and kind of act like completely like, you know, a man would. So it is sometimes very challenging emotionally to cope and accept with the fact that you have to act differently. And then not to mention that women have to live that way for their entire lives. And it gets extra challenging when I start working with women who are going through extreme oppression that I sometimes witness in front of me that is really difficult to deal with. Anyway, this is the bedroom that they gave me to sleep in. So again, it's a, you know, it's a rug on the floor. And then I used clothing to cover up as like blankets and stuff. So some of the conditions that I stay in are pretty rough. This is where I bathed every day. So you got to have a really open mind, but worth it when you go out and photograph things like these orangutans being rescued and then released. Another project that I've had for 10 years is partnering with a female scientist, my dear friend, Rebecca Cliff, who studies sloths. She and I met nearly 15 years ago on a first sloth shoot that I did in Costa Rica. And she was studying sloths and we became friends, and she regaled me with all this incredible sloth information. And I realized that sloths were at the time one of the most underappreciated animals on earth. I had no idea there were 6 species of sloths, and some species hadn't been photographed really before by a professional photographer. And there are all these mysteries about their behavior. And so I got really fascinated with sloths. And so we started to travel. We did these expeditions, basically trying to photograph sloths, all 6 species. We've done 5 of the 6. The last one, we still need to do. The last one's mostly in Venezuela. So there's some political challenges with being there right now. So we're just kind of giving that situation some time to cool down. This is a pygmy sloth swimming in Panama. So really unique projects. This is one where I had to practice. This is just a funny little side note. I had to practice in my pool because I knew that if I was lucky enough to be in the water with a sloth that was swimming, it could just be very brief and I had to nail it. I had to just be ready. And I had never done underwater photography before. And so I did a lot of practicing, and this over-under technique is actually quite difficult. So I did practicing before in my pool, and this teddy bear has been a model for like koalas, pangolins, and in this case, a swimming sloth, and just put floaties on the teddy bear and worked for weeks in the pool trying to perfect the shots of this teddy bear. And so then it worked. I was very prepared when I entered a situation where I was with a sloth swimming. And then this became the cover of our new book. As I said, conservation photography is something that's incredibly close to my heart. And I'm really proud of the fact that through books that I've sold and prints and photo tours that I've led, I've managed to raise $250,000 for conservation for different groups. And I think this is something that one of the things that I really teach to the women that I mentor is that this career is not about collecting pretty pictures. This career is about doing something with these pictures to create change. And whether that's raising awareness or raising funds, whatever it is, we need to use these images to make people fall in love with these subjects, because human beings will protect what they love, right? And we need to make people fall in love. And in some situations, like with the sloths, just give people a window into their lives for the first time, these mysterious animals. And Becky has really single-handedly, through her work and the projects we've done together and her foundation, the Sloth Conservation Foundation, which I'm a trustee of, she's really helped make sloths a very popular, trendy animal. And that's something that is a bit of a double-edged sword, but really good in terms of raising awareness of what some of these animals are going through. And then one of my most recent projects that I'll tell you a little bit about is I worked on a leopard den project in the Jau Reserve in Botswana. And I had done a lot of den projects with big cats, but leopards were one that they're incredibly elusive. They tend to hide their very young cubs. They're very smart. They will also sometimes lead safari vehicles away from their den to trick them into fooling them where the cubs are, essentially. It took a long time to try to find the right female to work with, but this is a female that they refer to as the camp female that's incredibly habituated to vehicles. One of the big things about my job, since I work with newborns, is that I don't want to be a negative impact on my subjects. I don't want them to be stressed or nervous because I'm around. So I try to work with moms that are already habituated to humans or vehicles so that I'm not stressing her out when she has newborns. It's also the only way I'm going to get effective imagery is if she's relaxed. And so this is the camp female with her cubs. I worked with a guy named Kambango for over a 2-year period. We did 6 different shoots. And he was an absolutely incredible person to work with. He was a tracker as well as a guide. Leopards can disappear for 3-4 days or even longer. And so we would go out and look for her, and he was looking based on tracks on the ground, and also the knowledge. He had known this female for 8 years, and so the knowledge of the areas that she worked, that she liked. These were incredibly long days. Sometimes we would have 3 days of searching all day long, not finding her. And he always would be smiling and optimistic, and say, well, we'll find her tomorrow, and was one of the most hardworking people I've ever worked with. And then we also had days of just, waiting for cubs to appear for, 10 hours, and then we get 30 seconds of glory, which is all that it took and all that we needed. But it was, this really intimate, unique window into this very vulnerable situation where this mom was raising these cubs at this age. They're very vulnerable to attack by predators. And so it's something where leopards don't often grant you this window into their lives, and this female did. And I feel every time I have this experience with an animal, I feel incredibly privileged. And just the privilege of watching these two grow up was really something that I hold dear. They were 2 females. Sometimes in my job, we witness things, like I said, with the lion hunt, that are very challenging and difficult. This is one of the cubs learning how to kill. And the way that mom does that is she traps an animal. So she'll catch an animal, but not kill it. In this case, it was a kudu calf. And then it's up to the cubs to try to kill the calf. And that was brutal. It went on 45 minutes, and it was horrific. And eventually the calf just bled to death. But they did eventually become amazing hunters. And mom taught them all of that. And then the play behavior, not just between the cubs, but also between the cubs and mom, as well as they were growing up. And then, just to talk a little bit about Girls Who Click and women in this career. This is Tui DeRoy. Tui DeRoy, when I was growing up, there literally were no women that I could look up to that worked alone. They usually all worked as a husband-wife team. There were no solo female shooters. And Tui DeRoy was the exception to that. She was the one that I mentored, that I looked up to. She grew up on the Galapagos, an incredibly strong woman. I had challenges starting in this career, feeling very much like it was an old boys club. Tui would have had 10 times more challenges than I did. And she's definitely was a trailblazer and a pioneer in our career, for sure. One of the things I think that's a challenge with this work is that as women, I think women are often intimidated by this field. And I think some of that can be camera gear that's marketed mostly towards men. If you look at all the marketing material, it's all towards men, for the most part, for wildlife lenses, I should say, and for the kind of gear that we need for wildlife. And so there can be that intimidation factor too, of like having to carry heavy gear. As you can see, I don't have like a really large muscular body, but I do stay fit so that I can carry all this. And it's something that I don't know if it's because of my initial experiences with the film crew, but it's something that never intimidated me. But we definitely, with working with younger generations of women, we've definitely found that this can be an issue, but particularly the marketing aspect. When women are thinking about becoming photographers, and they're seeing that all the wildlife photographers they see are men, and then all of the gear is marketed towards men. It's not very inspiring to be an aspiring nature photographer as a woman. And then also too, it can just be incredibly lonely and isolating being a woman in this field. And that's how it was for me when I was getting started. And it's not just in the field that you experience these things. In fact, some of the worst isolation I have felt has been in professional environments like conferences. I can remember a conference where walking up to to get a latte, and it's the North American Nature Photography Association conference, which is sort of the big one in the United States for nature photographers. And I love that foundation, by the way. They're fantastic for aspiring photographers. But I remember walking up to get a latte, and one of the sort of top names in the business that I really admired his work. I was already a professional, and he knew who I was, and I knew who he was. And he was with a few of his male friends, and he looked at me and he said, "Susie, the little girls line is over there." And I remember just being so devastated, because it was this person that I really admired the work of. Again, I was young and I didn't really have my voice yet. And I just quietly left. And so that kind of thing can be really hard and demoralizing. It can make you sort of feel like, okay, I should never go to a conference like that again. But luckily for me, I just sort of had this attitude of like, bury my head in the sand, forget what other people are saying. And all I cared about was that I succeeded in this job, and that it worked, and that I wanted to be a full-time wildlife photographer. So that was my strategy for so many years, was just like bury my head in the sand, keep going, laser focused, no matter what, through the worst experiences of sexual harassment, whatever it was like, don't complain, just stay focused. And then when I hit 40, I started to do a lot of spiritual work in my own life. And I started to really sort of see my life as how am I serving others? And I know, through my conservation work, I'm very proud of that. I've certainly been of service with that, but I felt this need to be of service to other women. And so one of the things that I did was I started just this tiny workshop on my own, an annual workshop that I would do in Monterey. That was a free wildlife photography workshop for teen girls. And I just did it, like, I just thought, well, this is a tiny, tiny little thing I can do to make a difference. And the amount of support when I did my first one that year, I thought I budgeted that I'd pay for the boat charter. I budgeted that I'd pay for the reserve entry. I could not believe the support that I got. The boat charter guy whom I'd used for many years, he was like, "Susie, you're doing this for free?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "This is awesome. You can have the boat for free." And I didn't expect that at all. The reserve said, "This is amazing. We'll give you free entry. And by the way, do you want to use our classroom to teach the girls?" And then my female colleagues started reaching out, because I publicized this on social media. And they said, "Hey, if you ever do need help with anything like this, let me know." But it was just this little workshop. I didn't need help. I could handle this on my own. So I did this for a couple of years, and I felt so fulfilled, and I felt so inspired by the girls I was working with. And I was so encouraged, because there were so many young women that were aspiring to do this professionally. And so I decided, wait a minute, what if all those colleagues that reached out to me, what if they did the same thing in their hometowns and did free wildlife photography workshops for teens there? And so I decided to start this nonprofit. So my assistant read a book on how to start a nonprofit. We started Girls Who Click, and we started with these free workshops. And then we later evolved into an ambassador program to essentially, and the ambassador program is kind of our flagship program now. But what we do with our ambassador program is it's a year-long mentorship with a partner pro. So we have 29 partner pros who are all the top females in the industry. And our ambassadors will have a year-long mentorship with them, and then some other perks and bonuses as well from our sponsors. And it's been an incredible experience. But I think for me, the most important thing that's come out of Girls Who Click, which sort of not what I intended, is we have these community, when I say community events, I mean the Girls Who Click community, where we have these meet and greets. We get together once a month or once every other month with our partner pros and our ambassadors. The ambassadors are, of course, our aspiring photographers between the ages of 16 and 30. And we have these chats, and these chats have become a safe space for women to talk about issues that they're facing in this field that are incredibly difficult. Some of them are just general, like how to make a living, or how can you afford gear, but then there's others that come up that are incredibly powerful, stories of sexual harassment, stories of sexism. And in some ways, the meet and greets are disturbing, because for me, it's like, wow, this is still really happening. And at my worst moments, I think, has anything actually changed? And then I realized things are changing, things are getting better. We have a lot of men on our advisory board, particularly younger generation of photographers who are helping. And it's become these community events, these meet and greets, it's all women. And because of that, it's this group, it's basically, we've created sisterhood in wildlife, nature, photography that was not ever there. We never had any ounce of sisterhood, and now we have it. So if our girls experience sexism or sexual harassment, they can come to these meet and greets and share, and we can give advice on how to deal with it. They can also share it with their mentor. So I feel like we've truly created this community where we can empower women in this field and really lift each other up, and particularly the younger women that are just coming into this, so that maybe they don't have to experience some of the things that I had to experience coming in. And that's just something that I'm immensely proud of. So I'll end on that, because I'm sure we have questions.
Wow. Suzi, thank you for such an amazing presentation, and what a career and a life you've had. So we can open it up to questions. Just go ahead and unmute yourselves and ask. I have one quick question to follow up on what you were just talking about. It was difficult when you started out, and I was going to ask you, are you seeing that change? I love that. Are you seeing that change? But given your just the comment you just made, it's like, wow, that has been slow, but maybe there's just a glimmer of progress.
Yeah, we're absolutely seeing change. And where I feel most hopeful is the younger generations of male photographers. And when I say younger, I mean like 30, in their 30s and in their 20s. They're way more inclusive of women. They're also way more inclusive of diversity. So that's another thing, is that one of the reasons why we created the ambassador program is because we were looking at our partner photographers. It was largely white female. So nature, wildlife, conservation photography is very white male dominated. And so we were looking at our partner photographers and saying, we're like almost exclusively white, because we have to be a partner photographer for Girls That Click. The photographer has to be pro. So it can't be someone who does photography as a hobby. They have to be making a living from photography or teaching photography. So we have certain standards, and we really were finding that it was really not diverse at all. And so one of the things that we did is when we started the ambassador program, we decided, okay, we want the ambassador program to be 50 to 60% diverse. When I say diverse, I mean from cultural backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds, LGBTQ, and we really wanted to have more inclusivity. And one of the ways that we've done that is the ambassador program, because we can do that because they don't need to be professional photographers. They can be aspiring photographers. And so that's been a really good experience too, of seeing that as well. Because when you look at diverse women, one of our partner photographers, Inka Creswell, she's British, she's Black, she's an underwater filmmaker. So underwater filmmaking is even more white male dominated than this stills realm. And she has a whole different set of challenges than most young female photographers coming into this. She's got the fact that she's female and the fact that she's Black, and she deals with both of those on a regular basis. And so that's another thing we really believed in, is trying to increase diversity in our community as well. And we've succeeded with that, which is great. So that's hopeful as well, is to see girls. We're not just seeing a lot of men, younger generations of men wanting to help and be more inclusive. We're also seeing these women wanting to come into this field that are a more diverse set of women, which is also really, really great as well. And something that means a lot to us.
Thank you. Anybody have a question or a comment for Suzi? Lily.
Okay, hello. I can turn my camera on to say hello too. I've been quietly listening from my bedroom at home. Hello. So one of the things you said that really stuck with me, which is that the goal of what you see your work is to make humans fall in love. You said, humans protect what they love.
Yeah.
Do you have any sort of wisdom or things that you've learned over the years that sometimes I notice humans might fall in love with a still or maybe a documentary they've seen, but how do you make the jump from loving and caring about something in a window to kind of creating a lifestyle change? Sort of that broader field of, I know there's a lot of people who introduce themselves at the beginning who work in the science education space. So how do you make that jump from this is a very cute image, I really connect with this animal, to maybe putting some fundraising out there or making change in your community to, carry on that work?
So, okay, so one of the, there's a few things. One, I try to use my social media following as an awareness tool to make people understand, like, for example, I just posted about, I can't remember which animal day it was. I think it may have been Elephant Day, World Elephant Day. I'm not sure. Anyway, oh, it's Pangolin Day. And it was, okay, how can you help pangolins at home? Because you don't have to be living in these pangolin countries to help pangolins, right? So to equip people, I can't tell you how many people say, when I post stuff like that, they'll say, thank you so much for posting things that I can do, because so many people just don't know what to do, right? They're just so overwhelmed. They have no idea how my little life in, Petaluma, California, how can I make a difference for pangolins living in Africa and Asia, right? And so there's that, giving people the information and the tools that they can use, but also it's taking, for me, it's been actually like using my photography to make people fall in love with it and to give money to, right? So for example, like, okay, I love that image, I want to buy that sloth book. And then a certain percentage of that goes to a charity, right? So for me, it's been with my book projects, almost every single book I do, 30% goes to an organization that is working in wildlife conservation, right? So it's like, I almost like try to hook them, like make them fall in love, and then use the fundraising aspect. Because for me, one of the things I felt very early on in my career is, okay, awareness is great, and I will do that because it's a very easy thing for me to do. It takes time, but it's easy, right? But we need money. We need actual funds for conservation. It's not enough to just use our wildlife photography and it's an awareness tool. We need to actually raise money. And so I'll do things like with the Sloth Conservation Foundation, we do a calendar every year that's actually a good money-making tool for SLOCO. With Sumatran Orangutan Society, I actually organized an event, and I spoke, we had a silent auction, and, we're using my images for a lot of this. And we raised, I can't remember how much it was. I think it was $20,000 for conservation. I'll also speak on behalf of other organizations sometimes. So like the Cheetah Conservation Fund has a private event where I show up and I speak, and their incredible fundraising team can raise $250,000 in 4 hours. And so it's these kind of things where our imagery is just a hook to get people involved and to get people to give money. And yeah, so I don't know if that answers your question, but I think you have to make people feel empowered that they can do something to make a difference at home. Right? Because it's really easy to feel so distant and isolated from the situation that you're promoting.
Definitely, that does answer my question. Thank you so much for
You're welcome.
everything. This has been really interesting.
Oh, I'm so glad. Thank you.
Anybody else with a question or a comment, feel free.
Hi. I also had a question. Can you hear me correctly?
Yes.
Yep.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. I was just wondering because I wanted to ask you if you had any, I don't know, like any advice on people, specifically me. I've loved photography for a long time now, and I always I have a camera and I've taken pictures with my phone, and I just love capturing this perfect moments. And I was just wondering if you had any advice for starting photography professionally.
Okay. So my first question is, are you speaking of nature photography or just general photography?
I've always been more interested in nature photography, so I would go more into nature photography.
Okay, so if I'm assuming you're under 30, and then you would be eligible to apply for the Girls Who Click Ambassador program, which is free. That is something that will absolutely help your career. Again, you'd be partnered by partnered with a mentor that is a professional for a year. So that's one thing that can really help. Another thing that I always suggest to people is just based on how I got started, I did have the opportunity to go to Africa and work with that team, but I didn't sell those pictures in the beginning. The way I made my name for myself is the harbor seal girl. And I was taking photos of harbor seals. I spent a lot of in-depth time with harbor seals. They were my local subject, right? So they were basically in my backyard. And I was the only person who had ever spent that much time photographing harbor seals. I did 3 seasons, so 3 pupping seasons with them. I set up a little blind where I was able to photograph them giving birth, nursing the newborn pups, all things that nobody else had gotten before. And so I was able to make a name for myself based on that, because if you think about it, everybody thinks they're a photographer. Everybody thinks that they can take pictures on their phone and be a good photographer, right? And it's not helping the industry. It's really, really hard. But one of the ways, so if you think about an editor who maybe is sitting at a conference all day doing portfolio reviews, and in fact, my Ranger Rick editor said this to me. I have so many people who come up to me and show me a portfolio of like, oh, here's a cheetah here, or a bear here, or like a raccoon here, and then a possum here. But she sees tons of portfolios like that, right? She calls them generalist portfolios. But then I come in with this harbor seal thing, and I stand out. It's like, oh, I've never seen anything like this before. So one of the things when you have so many people competing to be seen is to make yourself different somehow. It should definitely be something you're passionate about. You shouldn't be doing it just because you want to appear different. But for me, I was quite passionate about this work with harbor seals. I was absolutely madly obsessed with harbor seals for 3 years of my life. I just thought that they were the most fantastic creatures on earth. And so I was passionate when I was talking about them as well to this editor. And so I think that picking a local subject, because obviously then it doesn't take a huge amount of finances, and doing an in-depth project on a local subject, and it could be honeybees, it could be anything, and then creating a portfolio on that subject is your best way of standing out and trying to create some imagery. So in the beginning, a photography career is all about building a portfolio. It doesn't matter whether you're shooting nature, people, whatever it is, you have to build a body of work. And not all of us have the ability to go travel. And also, again, it doesn't really help to do that because then you're more of a generalist and you're out there with everybody else. So I would say find a local project you're passionate about and focus on that project and do it for like a year or 2 years until you're getting some really unique imagery, and then try to submit it to a magazine.
So I just real quickly, I put the girlswhoclick.org as well as Suzi's website in the chat for people who want to take a look at that or want to sign up, apply to be an ambassador. So yeah, go ahead.
Also, too, we're open. The ambassador application period is open now. So it is only open. I can't remember when our deadline is. It'll be on the Girls Who Click website, but it's only open for a few weeks every year. And right now just happens to be that window where we're open. So if you are interested in applying, you should do it now. Otherwise, you'd have to wait a whole nother year.
Thank you so much for your response. And I really, I'm also really grateful for the talk. I don't know, it's really empowering to hear women speak for themselves. Yeah, I don't know. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm so glad.
Go ahead, Chen.
Oh, hi. Thank you, Suzi, for the very interesting talk. I'm very interested in taking photographs with my camera, and I kind of participated in some photographer communities, and I actually had a coach for street photography and another coach for landscape photography for several years. But what I learned from these two coaches is that they are not gentle with their criticism. They are very direct, and they are very proud of being very direct. And they shared with us that this is a culture in a professional photographers to be really to really criticize to the point, and to be very straightforward with your criticism, and to extend that they can always find fault in almost any shot taken. So I don't know if this is also the culture in live photography, but I wonder. So, but I felt that this is not very friendly to beginners, and also not very friendly to people who are traditionally marginalized from this career. So I wonder, like, if you think there is a need to shift that culture, or if there is a need to better prepare the beginners, especially the beginners who are traditionally marginalized from this career, to handle that direct criticism better, and to be prepared for that.
Okay, yeah, I mean, that's a loaded question, and that is something, unfortunately, that is absolutely true of photography in general. And I would say nature and wildlife photography is not exempt from that. That is exactly the kind of behavior that I can't stand. And that I've always been, when I said like laser focused, I got a lot of that criticism too. So first and foremost, I would say fine-tune new mentors, because it sounds like your mentors are pretty shitty. So they're not going to do anything worthwhile if they're teaching you that way. But one of the big things I think is that I think photography in general is an incredibly competitive arena. Nature and wildlife photography reminds me, the old boys club was very much like your camera replaced your gun. You know, it's like my big lens, like my big gun, the big gun mentality. And even a lot of the verbiage we use, and I'm at fault. I say shoot a lot, like I have a shoot coming up, right? Like if you think about that word shoot, like that's not the best word. Why do we say shoot instead of project, right? But we use this verbiage that's quite aggressive in everyday talk in photography. But there is this incredibly cutthroat, competitive vibe in photography that I really have my whole life detested. And I've been in situations where I have to tolerate that. Usually it's in a wildlife photography situation where it's like, I can't do it solo. I have to do it as a part of a group. You know, like Antarctica is a great example. You can't just go to Antarctica alone, right? You have to go to Antarctica with other people because of logistical challenges. And so I think that you have to learn to tolerate that and to ignore it and not let it phase you, but also not pander to it as well, right? And so my strategy and my defense mechanism was just forget what they say. Who cares what they're saying about your work? Just stay laser focused. I was pigeonholed as like the baby animal photographer, which I am, and now I'm proud of it, but I didn't own it earlier because people poo-pooed it so much, particularly the men in my career. It was like, oh, Suzi, the cute photographer, the baby animal photographer. I had so many men in my career, so many of my male colleagues say, you should just have a baby of your own and get it over with. That's obviously why you're so obsessed with baby animals. I've had them say, I had photographers literally tell me to my face, you'll be barefoot and pregnant in 4 years. I've had photographers, when they're trying to get a position that I have for taking a photo, because that's like literally, you're sometimes in situations where people are trying to like elbow each other out of the way. I've had a photographer try to make me move, a male photographer, get his finger in my face and say, you listen to me, little girl. I mean, there are so many ways that our sort of quote unquote old boys club demeans people who are marginalized or just each other. I mean, you watch them with each other, they're brutal with each other too, right? So it's not just reserved for those of us that are marginalized. It's just generally that kind of behavior. One of the things that I think is happening is that I think nature and wildlife photography is slowly becoming a kinder place and a kinder arena. And I really think, you know, a lot of men would be angry hearing me say this, but I think a lot of that is because there are more women coming into it. There's more diversity coming into it. And, you know, it's no longer that it's becoming less about white male dominated, look at my big gun kind of arena than it used to be. But I can remember going up, there'd be like, you know, a crowd of photographers at Yellowstone or something on the side of the road. And I can remember walking up and be like, every single one of them was a male, you know, lots of them all in camo looking super macho. And I remember feeling like so intimidated, like, do I even want to like come up? Like, I really want this photo, but do I want to deal with all this? Do I want to deal with this crap? Just recently, I was on a trip where I was around this really competitive vibe. I don't like it. To this day, I can't stand it, which is why I've chosen to do a lot of my work solo. Almost all of my shoots, they're solo endeavors because I don't have to deal with that noise. I don't have to deal with the bad energy. Going back to your question of, is this also good for us? And I think that goes back to the thick skin, right? Do we need to have a thick skin? I'd be lying if I said no, because one of the things I think that has helped me when I was in UC Santa Cruz, I was in a photography class every quarter, and my photography professor was amazing. He was so supportive of my work and really believed in what I wanted to do. I think one of the things that my peers were not prepared for what I was going to show at all. So it was very artistic. It was very fine art photography. Everybody else, I was coming in with like elephant seals giving birth, harbor seals giving birth, and I got creamed in my peer reviews. People were like, this isn't photography, this isn't art, like, you know, what is this? And I honestly, it gave me a thick skin that I think was very useful for me later in life, where I could just say, I don't care what they say, I'm just going to stay laser focused. The other thing I think that helped is I was bullied as a child. And so when you go through that, I think you learn to just sort of like stay laser focused and not worry too much about what other people think of you and just stay true to your passion and your heart, right? So yeah, some of those really tough experiences can be quite useful in your career. But for someone close to you, like a mentor that you're working with regularly, if they're giving out that energy and if they're treating your work that way, that's not a mentor. That's someone who has their own chip on their shoulder, their own agenda, and they're not really trying to teach you anything. So I would say find some better teachers, some more supportive teachers, and do not listen to people like that. Sorry, that was long-winded.
That's all right.
That fires me up.
Thank you.
So if no one else has a question, I have one last question. Go
I
ahead,
had
Alex.
a question.
I'll
Yeah,
tell
hi.
you.
What a great talk, and thank you so much for your work. It's fantastic. When I'm working on videos, I often, visit stock places like Shutterstock or Pond5.
Yeah.
Is that a viable option for young photographers who are trying to break in? Is that? I often wonder where these pictures come from, and is that, is it a lucrative way to go, or is it an exploitative way to go for photographers?
So sadly, it's very exploitive. When I got started in this field, the stock industry was dying. It was slowly dying out. So before I got started, some of my older colleagues were, making, the most successful ones were making like 20, 30 grand on stock every month. And back then it was all rights managed. So what rights managed, for those of you who don't know, is rights managed is like, I want to buy this lion photo. Well, on Shutterstock, you just buy it for like a general usage, or there can be like, various levels of usage, right? And then you get to use it, you buy it and you get to use it forevermore, right? But with rights managed, you'd have to say, I want to use this lion photo specifically for this purpose. So If it's in a book, the agent says what size, the agent says what's the print run, the agent says what's the territory. So that's what the rights managed concept is all about. And it's much more lucrative than the Shutterstock business. Shutterstock photographers are literally making pennies on the dollar. And it's what they call royalty-free imagery. So when royalty-free started to come up, stock agencies and stock photographers were very, very resistant. But it was, unfortunately, it was like, you can't stop that train. It's coming. And what it really was amateur photographers saying, oh, you know, I'm an amateur, so I don't care if I make pennies on the dollar, right? They're not looking for a paycheck. They're just wanting to do something with their photos just for fun, or just to see their name in lights or whatever it is, right? And so this idea of giving imagery away almost for free, or literally for free in some cases, killed the stock industry. So I have an agent who's still rights managed, but it's very unusual, and he still does quite well for me. But again, he's sort of a boutique agency, and he's known as like the top wildlife photography agency in the world. And because his images are so high quality, he's able to retain some of those customers who are willing to pay top dollar, who know that if they go on Shutterstock, they're never going to find anything that's as high quality. But sadly, most buyers don't care. Most buyers really can't recognize a mediocre photo from a really good one. So if they can find a panda photo on Shutterstock that a tourist took, they're not going to care if it's maybe a little bit less quality than the one on my agent's site. It'd be a lot less quality, but in their mind, it's not something that people really notice or see. And so it's definitely not at all. If you find Shutterstock people that are making a living, usually they're outside of the United States, where the cost of living is much lower, or they're just churning out photography that is basically, you could do almost as a machine, right? So like images of products or items or clothing or whatever it is, right? But generally speaking, royalty-free imagery is not viable at all. The only thing that's viable in the way of stock goes are the boutique. But what I tell my girls and Girls Who Click is like, stock photography is not like the fact that I still do well, I'm very much the exception to the rule. I think also part of the reason why I still do well is because I just so happen to shoot a subject that's quite saleable, right? Everybody loves baby animals. I don't shoot it because it's saleable. I love it, but everybody likes baby animals, so I'm lucky. My agent has photographers that are working with reptiles or something, and they're like, you know, not making great money because their subject matter is different. So I always tell my girls, do not think about stock photography as a reliable source of income. If you think about it at all, think about it as gravy on top of something else, right? Just as a little bonus money, right? If you're in Shutterstock, don't even think about bonus money. I tell my girls to stay away from things like Shutterstock because it is so not photographer friendly. Good question though. Yeah.
And my last question, and I appreciate the extra time, Susie.
Yeah, no, happy to.
Well, with the Girls Who Click Foundation, are you now seeing some of these girls who've been ambassadors and who've been mentored actually getting a foot in the door and pursuing photography as a career?
Yes, we are. More than that, what we're seeing, and this is one of the things we teach in Girls Who Click, is that we don't want to give our girls the false impression that wildlife photography is like a super viable way to make a living, because it's not. The truth of the matter is only a small percentage of us actually are lucky enough to do so, right? So what we do is we teach, you know, you can try to do photography as a full-time career, but there are challenges to that. But yes, you can try, and here are some helpful tools, but you can also use photography in conjunction with another career. So a lot of our girls are aspiring conservationists. Lots of them are scientists. They're biologists getting started in something. So they might use photography as part of their biology. And so there's definitely different ways that we teach our girls you can utilize photography. But having said that, there are a couple girls that have come through the ambassador program that are absolutely shining stars. And I look at them and I'm like, they're 100% going to make it, hands down. Those, you know, in 5 years, they're going to be pro. And that's the idea, our idea. So we have our ambassadors are allowed to apply to a continuing ambassador program because we want to keep them in our community and we want to keep them in our network. And so one of the ideas and the hopes is that our ambassadors will eventually be partner photographers. And there's a couple of our continuing ambassadors that are nearly ready for that. Like they in the next year or two will become partner photographers where they're mentoring somebody else and being able to speak about how they're using their photography as a career. Having said that, there are girls who go through the program and they, you know, over the year, they find that it's just too challenging and they don't want to pursue it and they pursue something else as a career and they leave nature photography behind. And that's okay too. You know, that's one of the things that mentors help with are making tough decisions like that. Of whether or not they should actually choose this kind of life, because there are massive challenges, you know, that some of which I didn't even talk about today that can be really challenging for your personal life, like being gone all the time. Not everyone can deal with that. It's also very challenging being a mom. So some of our girls that want to be moms, it's totally possible. We have a few partner photographers that are moms, and I love that because they're doing conservation photography and being a mom at the same time. But it definitely adds extra layers of challenges that some women don't want to deal with.
That's so nice to hear that these girls, some of them are really pursuing this, and that blends in with some of the work that we're looking at here. So once again, I want to thank Suzi Eszterhas for such a fabulous talk and for your time today, especially since you're on the West Coast and it's a lot earlier there than it is here.
Well, thank you. And I'm so sorry that I was late. So thanks for your
Not
patience.
a problem. It was more than made up for. And I will send out the link for the talk and we'll be posting it to our YouTube channel. I'll send that to you, Suzi, and I'll send that to our list as well. So once again, I want to thank you, Suzi, very much for your time and what a fascinating career and a fascinating story. So, and thank you everybody for joining us today. It's been a nice hour and a half almost. So thank you again.
Thank you for having me.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.